It's no secret that writing can be lonely work, but does it really have to be? Whether you're full-time, part-time, or just starting out, you'll get insights into the tricks, tips, and production habits of writers from every level of the biz. From best-selling authors to those launching their first novels, you're sure to be in the company of friends as we encourage great writers to divulge and share their secrets. This is the Great Writers Share podcast with your host, best-selling author, Daniel Wilcox.
Hello and welcome to episode number 59 of the Great Writers Share podcast, where every week we hijack an hour or so of time from some of the kindest and hardest working writers around today to join us on the show and discuss everything that makes them tick, roar and bounce. Today's date is Monday the 19th of October, and we'll dive straight in to my personal update. So in fiction news, there's been a lot going on. Today, as of the day of recording, marks the release of my anthology, The Other Side, a horror anthology, which has been very, very much prevalent in my mind for the past few months. It's all gone very quick. I'm incredibly happy with how it's all turned out. But yeah, it's been an experience in running an anthology, in getting the submissions in, reading through the submissions, trying to find sort of smooth processes, because this is something that I definitely want to do going forward, because the biggest thing that's come from just putting the anthology together is the networking with people. It's the meeting new voices. I have 10 authors within the anthology, as well as myself, who we've all been working together to get the book edited. It's been fantastic just sort of getting to know a little bit of their journey, to get a chance to raise their voices and promote their work. And the whole thing's just been, for me, a positive through and through. And yeah, I'm really, really proud of what we came out with at the end. I'm already in the process of looking into the next anthology, whatever that'll be. I may or may not have literally just bought a new cover. But yeah, so the anthology is out. That's really exciting. I put that out specifically. I really wanted to get this out in time for Halloween, because I think there's a lot of content there that would please any kind of reader, really. You don't even have to be just a horror reader. You can be anyone that wants something with a bit of a dark spin for Halloween. And yeah, so that's out. So I'll put a link for where you can get that in the show notes, or you can just head over to the Devil's Rock Publishing website and click on the tab at the top and get your copy there. And I'll probably report back in a few weeks to let you know how it's gone in terms of sales and stuff. But mostly for me, this is just getting work out and, as I say, raising other people's voices. When Winter Comes is also ticking along very, very nicely. When Winter Comes episode 5 came out the 7th of October, and I'm currently chipping away at episode 6, which is going to come out in the middle of November. So it's all narrowing down to the finish. This is going to be the last book in the serial. I'm 100% sure. I'm getting a new cover together for the box set collected edition that should be through next month. So it's all coming together. All those pieces are sort of wrapping up, and that's where crunch time will really come in terms of what the product does, I believe. Because the collected version, so far with episodes 1 to 6, I've only released those as ebooks because for people that don't know, if you put up a paperback on the KDP system, you cannot really ever take down the paperback, whereas if you've put up an ebook, it's very easy to recall that and just clear that off your page. And although obviously there's a lot of reviews attached to the current books and everything else, I'm not 100% sure yet I want those to stick, because I'm trying to think where I go next. But the collected version is going to be in paperback, it's going to be in hardback. I'm looking at getting the audiobook done. I'm really sort of bringing together this comprehensive product that's going to be, it's looking at about 130,000 words in total for this story, which I'm loving the story. Like, it's been a while since I've really stuck into a book that spoke to me from sort of like a much longer standpoint. And this will be the first ever solo large project I've written, with just my name attached, which is going to be a very, very different perspective for me as the guy that tends to collaborate with a lot of people. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, that's currently what I'm chipping away on in terms of fiction. In terms of non-fiction, I'm doing a lot of groundwork at the minute for building some non-fiction roots. So long-term listeners of this show know that I released a book on collaboration for authors this year. They'll know that I'm currently chipping away at a productivity book for not just authors, but creatives in general. But I am also currently building a whole platform around non-fiction and finding a way to support authors, because I believe there's a lot of value that I can give to authors, and there's a lot that I want to give back to the community that has sort of been so kind to me. So I'll keep you posted of all that, and that'll be coming probably in the next couple of months. But it's very exciting. There's a lot going there, and I did give a little tease in this week's Next Level Authors podcast as well, so feel free to check that out. And I will also add, so this will be my third, Jesus Christ, my third book release of this month, which was the marketing side of the 9 Things Career Authors Don't Do series with Jay Thorne. So me and Jay worked together on getting a book all about the 9 biggest things within the marketing sphere that I felt I could contribute to the author community, things that I've learned about from my own experience working in marketing for over half a decade. And yeah, I'm really, really proud of what we put together. And it's quite a short read. It's 10,000 words, but there's some key valuable lessons, I think, that you can really pick up a lot from. So just find that series on Amazon. There is a universal link that I'll pop into the show notes. But yeah, 9 Things Career Authors Don't Do, Marketing with Daniel Wilcox and Jay Thorne. So check that out. And just one final note, anyone who's looking into getting involved in this year's NaNoWriMo 2020, which kicks off at the beginning of November and runs throughout the entirety of November, I am running a NaNoWriMo bootcamp, which is essentially a live sprint. Join me twice a week for an hour and a half. I've got different times you can get involved in. And essentially the whole point of this is to act as an accountability partner, to give you a time slot to be writing in the morning or the evenings, whichever suits best for you guys. And just to hold your hand and make sure that you're getting the words in, getting it done, and hopefully finishing NaNoWriMo, because obviously that's the challenge, is to write the 50,000 words within the 30-day period. It's difficult, it's tough. I've been there. I've been a winner, I've been a loser, in general as well. But for anyone who wants to check that out and basically get some extra support, join a community of a very fast growing community of authors jumping in, getting involved in live Zoom sprints with myself, then head on over to www.danielwilcox.com/bootcamp, and I will pop a link for that in the show notes as well. But one more time, that's www.danielwilcox.com/bootcamp. Our question of the week this week was nice and simple, but I think it's quite a deep one. Why your genre? And yeah, we did get a slew of responses on that. So the wonderful Holly Line, co-host, What's Up Holly, says, I didn't consciously choose my genre. I grew up on horror and dark fiction, so I guess it's kind of in my blood. It was only when I began really trying to sell it that I had to think about how to define it. I do want to be more conscious of genre as I move through my author career, however, but I'll always write dark fiction. Totally feel that. That's definitely been my experience in everything I've tried up to this point. Laura Kay, who is a brand new patron, welcome Laura to the community, says, I've always been like, I don't have a genre, you can't tame me. Don't we all start like that? But recently I've realised that I actually do have a genre. Everything I write has a fantasy sort of theme running through it, especially now I'm older and some of the angst has left my system. Yanni Jade says, I guess I've always been drawn to mythology and fantasy, so to then write about it was something I felt I could do, and I wanted to write a story I would have read or watched if it were a series or movie. I love the idea of a hidden world beyond the veil, being just out of reach of reality or hidden in plain sight. Faye Tresk, I love when the co-hosts get involved. What's up, guys? I chose and love dark fantasy because it's closer to what we have to deal with every day. Life isn't perfect. We have challenges and obstacles to navigate. We lose people and we have to figure out how to stand up for what we believe is right. We aren't guaranteed a happy ending and can even help someone get through it, and especially dark time. Love that. That's the whole point of fiction for me. Andy Conduit Turner with my shortest and one of my favourite responses, always was a spooky kid. That's true. If you ever meet Andy, say hi. I believe, without teasing too much, or I might get this wrong, but I think Andy will be coming on the show in the next few weeks. So looking forward to that. Do a couple more. Meg Jolly says, epic fantasy, the genre where quite literally anything is possible. Jasmine Plate says, as a pagan and a kitchen witch, I've always felt there was more to the world than we suspect. It fascinates me to no end. Also, if you can make shit up, that always seems easier than doing the research to put stories in the, quote, real world. I definitely agree with that a lot. It's one of the reasons I tend to look towards sort of a fantastical element of horror, is that it does require a little bit less research, and you can have a bit more fun with sort of the broken reality of whatever you create. Final one from Ritu, who says, I kind of made my own genre up, chickpea curry lit. Chick lit with an Indian twist, because I write best when it's something I can relate to. And Ritu goes a lot into that in one of the previous episodes. I think go back 5 or 6 episodes, Ritu was on the show and she speaks all about that. So if that interests you, then definitely go back and check that episode out. So today's guest is V.S. Holmes, an award-winning author and someone who advocates for queer and disabled representation. And that's a topic that we dive into quite heavily because I definitely have my own questions when it comes to writing characters that I am generally unfamiliar with. We talk about their awards and life as a contract archaeologist and author. We go a little bit into tiny homes, and we talk a lot about collaborative universities and building an imprint, as they have built an imprint with Amphibian Press, and how that has all kind of worked in terms of promoting their work and working with other authors there. So stick around, and that will come up very, very shortly. Before we get into the interview, I want to remind you all about Patreon, where for as little as $1 a month, you can get involved in our behind the scenes community. You can get early access to all episodes. You can ask questions. You can get involved in our monthly giveaway, which this month is Blake Snyder's Save the Cat. We have a monthly Patreon Q&A, which me and the guys recorded last night, which is going to be a 1.5 hour Q&A just of all things that people have asked, anything they wanted to know, so you can jump over and get that. And I also did mention this briefly earlier, but I want to give a massive welcome to Laura Kay for joining the Great Writer Share Patreon community. So thank you. Your support keeps the lights on, keeps the wheels turning, and keeps the show going. So if you fancy getting access to a load of extra good stuff, head over to www.patreon.com/Great Writers Share. But now, without any further ado, we'll dive into the interview with the one and only V.S. Holmes. V.S. Holmes is an international best-selling author. They created the REFORGED series and the NEL Bentley books. Smoke and Rain, the first book in their fantasy quartet, won New Apple Literary's Excellence in Independent Publishing Award in 2015 and a Literary Titan Gold in 2020. In addition, they have published short fiction in several anthologies. When not writing, they work as a contract archaeologist throughout the northeastern US. They live in a tiny house with their spouse, a fellow archaeologist, their not-so-tiny dog, and own too many books for such a small abode. As a disabled and queer human, they work as an advocate and educator for representation in SFF worlds. V, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
I'm very excited to have you. There's a lot of stuff in your intro that's quite juicy that I want to jump into, but I'm going to start a little bit and go a bit more into depth with something that we briefly touched on before we started recording, which was tell us about this tiny house, because that has piqued my interest. Because there was what documentary was it? There was something on Netflix where they showed these tiny houses, and they seemed like such a good practical idea. So how did you get involved in one?
Well, I've always been sort of a project person. I like having many projects, usually too many projects. And when I first started in archaeology, I was drawn to the nomadic lifestyle of contract archaeology. And I thought, well, a smaller house or like an RV or something like that would be a really neat solution to living in the no-tell motels that we usually have to stay in. And as I was researching that, my dad, who built way back in the 70s when he was doing a lot of hitchhiking and stuff, he built a little camper on the back of his truck. And so I was thinking about that idea and about the Romani Vardos, with like the curved roof wagons. And I just kind of developed this idea. And of course, many other people were starting to do this movement. And that was back in about 2014. So that was when it first got really popular, and it sort of grew legs on its own.
Nice. And I mean, there is, like you say, something nice about that idea of a nomadic lifestyle. How does that play into your writing, or the way that you write? Are you someone that has to sit in a particular place? Are you someone that has to sort of roam around when you are trying to write and get your stuff done?
I don't have to sit in a particular place. I do need fewer distractions. I'm quite an introvert, so I like to have my quiet and my music and fewer distractions as possible. But I can really write almost anywhere, which is good because when we're traveling all over, it's like whatever hotel room, whatever cafe, back when we could go to cafes, that I can really pick up wherever I want. It's really about creating my own little tiny atmosphere. And that was something that's part of what the tiny house was about too, was kind of being a turtle and knowing how to take my home with me. Because when you are on the road, it's very easy to get homesick because there's nothing that's really a constant. So.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. What does life look like for a contract archaeologist? Can you explain a little bit of what that means, just in layman's terms?
The culture is very much kind of like a modern day cowboy.
Nice.
We're traveling from town to town, and we go in before a project that's that requires federal funding. So we'll go in for pipelines, power lines, road work, to make sure that whatever the project isn't going to impact whatever cultural remains are there, whether it's human remains or if it's artifacts. So we go through first, and we'll end up in really wild towns, really wild areas. And it's been really fun to sort of explore the various cultures and subcultures of New England.
Yeah, something I think we'll dig into a little bit more later. But can you just grace my listeners with a little bit of an intro about how you got into writing and where your writing journey started from?
I think I've always been a storyteller. I grew up with both my parents reading me a lot of stories. My mom is very literary, and my dad had a lot of wild stories, like I mentioned before, with like hitchhiking and his time in the service. And I really liked the backgrounds and how you can see how people became the people they are, and just the why of the story. So when I was very little, I was writing stories that probably weren't very good. And it took me until my teen years to really decide, oh, this is something I might want to pursue. And I didn't start doing it professionally until after I was out of college.
And what was the first real story where you thought, okay, maybe there's something I've put in here that has some kind of legs, could potentially do something?
That was actually Smoke and Rain, my first book. I definitely wrote and finished other stories before that, but I trunk them, and I did trunk Smoke and Rain a few times, but I just kept going back to it. And
what does trunk mean? Sorry, does trunk just throw away?
Just throw it in the trunk.
Okay. Nice. So Smoke and Rain was your first real project that you dived into, and not only did it win an award in 2015, but it's also got one pretty recently. So it's got to feel quite validating to know that a work that you've written, that, because I feel like you get a lot of people who seem to get there or get some real success, some real accolades in a particular work, but then it tends to stay within that time era. It tends to be a lot of people will get the awards within 2 years of each other, but to have 2 awards within 5 years, how did that come about, and how are you feeling after that success?
Well, the first award, the New Apple Award, I submitted it for, and I had kind of forgotten that I'd done that. And it was an utter surprise when I got the email, which was a couple days after it was supposed to be announced. I guess there had been sort of like a tie situation. And you can write a story and have friends and family think it's great, and that's fine. But you always have that thing in the back of your mind where like, oh, if it was actually that good. And then, then it got this award. And then more recently was sort of the same thing. I didn't realize that they had an award, and so it just happened to be their favorite book of the month, and that was really wonderful because it was also a very different audience. And reading, especially books that are more speculative, fantasy and sci-fi isn't for everyone, and it's nice to see that not only is it still popular, but it's also speaking to sort of a newer sci-fi fantasy audience, which was a little bit more specific with the newer award.
What would you say is about the book that has given it that sort of push to keep on giving to the reader? Is there anything that you can kind of think of that would be, the call?
Yeah, I definitely think that while there is, like the massive scope battles that a lot of fantasy has, I go more into the political stuff behind it and what's going on with the people and why that war is happening and its long-lasting effects, both psychological and sort of on the grander scale politically. And I think that's something that a lot of people are focusing more on now, as we're seeing a lot of political turmoil, and specifically in the United States, but also sort of globally. And delving into that, I think, is a lot more interesting for some people now.
Where did you get the understanding to be able to write these politically complex scenes and battles and everything? Because one would assume that from your experience within archaeology, that might not necessarily be something that you're familiar with. So how did you find that you approached the craft of writing that and put it in such a way that it's won these awards?
Well, my background is actually in biology, but I happened to be taking a military history course when I was in university, and I learned a lot about that. It was specifically modern United States military history. So I learned through that, but it was also encountering a lot of the political things with archaeology that we deal with, because we are the sort of in between federal projects and Native Americans. There's a lot of political stuff going on there, and we also have to study it and study how these people were impacted, regardless of which people we actually study, see how they've been impacted and how cultures have changed over time. And a lot of that is very political and very murky. And I was actually just talking to a historian recently, and I said that historians focus on what people say happened, and archaeologists sort of focus on what might have actually happened. And you're sort of trying to figure out what the real story is there. And so I think that there's a lot of political undercurrents in archaeology that has helped me sort of understand how people work or don't work together.
Absolutely. One thing that I love trying to get to the root of with guests that come on as well, because you mentioned that when you're writing this book, obviously there was something in you that said, this has power to go and potentially do something. Obviously, like when you first put your fingers to the keyboard on any project, there's never a guarantee that something's going to happen, particularly early on. And you said that you had friends and family that gave you some kind of validation. But what was it within yourself that thought, this is the project, this is one I'm going to roll ahead and sort of make meaty and flesh and make it come alive?
That's tough. I think part of it was whenever I got sort of in a low point with the project, there was kind of a stubbornness, and I've invested so much time, so I probably should see this through. So that's definitely part of it. But I think wanting to tell these characters' stories, because in a lot of ways they weren't characters that I'd necessarily seen in a lot of fantasy. There's a lot of darker thoughts. There's a lot of, well, what if the heroes aren't really necessarily good guys? What if the people who are saving the world no longer have a place in the world once they've saved it? And as someone who hasn't always felt like they have a place in a lot of mainstream society, that was something I really wanted to explore more. I think that was much more subconscious when I was younger. And then once I really took the project seriously, I wanted to do that with more intent.
No, fantastic. One question that popped into my head that is just completely, it's not something that I scripted, only popped up now that I've like seen you on the video feed. What is that bone behind you?
Which one?
The big curved one. Yeah. So this will be audio, so people won't be able to see it, but it's kind of, I don't know, maybe if you say what it is, like we'll know what it is, but.
So it's a cow, part of a cow's pelvis. This right here is where the head of the femur would go. And I found that on a job site. Its skull is actually out of frame above me.
Amazing. So I write horror, so I love seeing like bones and stuff. And
I mean, I also have a human skull back there too, but
nice. Hopefully not one of your enemies.
No, it's a medical specimen, thankfully.
Nice. Coming back into writing, so we mentioned.
Okay. Background.
I love it. It's so good. We mentioned in the intro, obviously, you've written fantasy and you've written sort of science fiction. How do you approach genre hopping? Because as someone who has genre hopped, I know that it can be quite difficult to balance. And I know that personally for me, it slowed my progress in certain areas where I could have potentially stuck with one thing and moved a bit quicker. Not that I'd change it in any way, because I'm happy with what I've done, but how do you approach genre hopping?
Well, it's interesting that you said that it slows you down. I don't know if it would slow me down, because I think with each book, my process changes so wildly that it's sort of hard to compare. I mean, some things stay the same, but my process with sci-fi and with fantasy are actually very different. Partially because, at least right now, the two projects I'm working on are pretty different in pacing and in point of view. So the work that each entails is very different. So that's part of it. But I also have to have, like I said, multiple projects. And so I will have a sci-fi going on at the same time as I have a fantasy, though maybe not in the same stage of drafting or revisions or whatever. So that's definitely helped me, I think. When I get frustrated with one, I can move on to another and kind of lose myself in that and remember, oh, I actually can write.
And they seem to be quite, I don't, because I've read a lot of fantasy, I've read a lot of sci-fi, but in my head, I'm trying to work out how I would approach writing either of them. And for me, I feel like there'd be a gap between fantasy, in which you can kind of make up pretty much anything that you want to, obviously within the realms of sort of the politics and everything that's sort of believable within the fantasy genre. But with sci-fi, it seems that there'd be a lot more research, a lot more sort of tactile craft in terms of sort of the world that you build in there. When you say that your approaches to writing them are different, how different are we talking? What are some of the key things that you take from one that you wouldn't bring into the other?
With my sci-fi, I write a little bit more chronologically than I usually do. With my fantasy, the scope of the outline and where, like, how I write the scenes is much broader, because I have, like 10 point of view characters versus my science fiction series is just one point of view character. So there's definitely that. And like you said, there is a lot more research with the science fiction, but it's a little bit easier because a lot of the science is more modern, and so there are a lot more articles on it for me to study. But also that particular character is an archaeologist, so I don't need to research. Though there's probably some names that I've changed because
Yeah.
I didn't want. So yeah, my process is pretty different, but I think at the core it's still a vague outline, and then I'll go into more detail, and then the outline will change 5 times throughout the process.
As it does with everyone.
Yes.
How do you fit in the writing around your what sounds like a very busy schedule?
Well, so our particular type of archaeology is seasonal, so I do have kind of a downtime in the winter where I can focus on a little bit more of my writing side of things. But I try to write pretty regularly. I'm getting better about not doing it every day because that's not quite sustainable for me right now. But I try and write either in the morning or before dinner once we've come out of the field, and that's pretty good. It's kind of nice actually when I do have sort of a set schedule, because it's easier to stick to that set schedule. Whereas like right now during quarantine, it's kind of a free for all, and my writing schedule has changed drastically, not necessarily for the better. But
is there still currently work at the minute for contract archaeologists during the pandemic, or is that one of the things that's sort of gone a bit on hold?
kind of both. There's definitely still work, but at least in New England, because all the states are so small, some of them have shut their borders, and the company that we were working for couldn't actually go work in the state where the project was. So there's definitely work out there. It's just sort of when and where. And like I said, with the hotels, a lot of the companies were having some issues trying to figure out how to do that safely. Our RVs were actually one of the solutions. I'm like, tiny house.
Please. Nice. I need to find. I don't think tiny houses really. Well, I was going to say they're not a thing in England. I know a friend who's getting one built currently, but they're definitely not hit the sort of the mainstream here. It seems to be at the minute quite an American thing.
Yeah. I think part of that is definitely the housing crisis in the United States. I mean, of course, I don't necessarily know what it's like in England, but that's definitely one of the huge drives. And there's also like the gentrification of the tiny house movement thing, which is not great. But yeah, I've seen maybe some army trucks that were repurposed in the UK, which were kind of cool looking. I'm pretty sure they were in the UK. So.
Something to look into. I'll be in the market for a new house soon. So one thing we didn't put in the intro is that you do a lot of work with, or you run Amphibian Press. Tell us a little bit about what Amphibian Press is and how that came to be and what it's trying to achieve.
Well, it started out as a way, just sort of business side of things, as a way to have an umbrella for my publishing. And one of my friends, my former business partner, she and I were working together to make publishing a little bit more accessible and a little bit more less gatekeepy, I guess. And now it's actually sort of morphed a bit more into a cooperative model, which I feel like is hoping to kind of focus on the transparency and just the community, because that's really the best part about publishing, is being able to have this community and this support without some of the weird, smoke and mirrors that a lot of mainstream publishing has.
Yeah, no, it's definitely something that we hear from a lot on the show is people who, like, one of the things I definitely try and bring to people with this podcast is a certain transparency, a certain looking behind the curtain at what an author's life really is. And I feel like there's a lot of, not even just within traditional publishing houses themselves, but within authors who think they have to create this persona of what it is for them to be an author and hide everything in the background, like the worries, the stresses, the rejections, all that kind of stuff. And I definitely think it's good to bring that to light. What are some of the things that you do within the company itself to communicate that transparency? And I'll tell you, the reason I'm asking is you can't see it, it's just out of frame, but I've recently launched my own horror publishing imprint. So one thing I want to do with that is really sort of give a voice to people who are otherwise unheard of within that community. I definitely want it to be like you say, it's something where you build the community, you really sort of just lift people up, and for it to be transparent about what goes on behind the scenes. So how do you feel that you're doing that with Amphibian?
I mean, a huge chunk of it really, and I think this is what needs to be the most transparent, is of course money. A lot of people have this romanticized idea about what it's like to be an author, or how much money you need to invest, or frankly how little money you need to invest, because that's not the case. It's it's definitely a labor of love. And so I really try and be transparent about that, as far as what works and what doesn't, and just how we really have to keep trying different methods. And also a lot of the methods are a little outdated and were built for a market that was growing, whereas now it's a mature market as far as ebooks and independent publishing go. And that's really what my focus is. But also I'm definitely focused on more marginalized voices and boosting those voices, because that's what publishing doesn't do. Mainstream publishing doesn't do. And though there are definitely imprints that are working towards that, I think that is one of the key things, because without diverse stories, we don't have our accurate history, and that sort of goes back to the archaeology history. So
yeah, what do you think is the secret to raising the voices of the marginalized communities? Because as we said in the intro, you obviously advocate for queer and disabled representation. Is that you, or does Amphibian sort of extend beyond that as well?
I mean, that's definitely me, but Amphibian does extend beyond that. Our platform isn't huge by any means, but I do try and use it to pass the mic, because that's something that really needs to be done with privilege. And I think it's something that, it's hard to just step back and be like, oh, well, I'll let this person speak, when you know that they're being actively silenced. So when you're able to pass the mic to them and say, here's this platform I built that people are already listening to, why don't you use it? And maybe, hopefully they'll start listening to you as well.
And it's a very bold venture to not only as a solo person go into these avenues of obviously increasing the representation in these sort of areas, but then to pretty much raise a platform and hold up these other writers as well. What is it about you or your past or where you're looking to go that gave you that push to build this kind of platform? Because I can imagine there are a lot of people that want to do things similar, but they don't feel like they've got necessarily the followers or the resources or sort of the knowledge behind them. What is it that gave you that oomph to go, yes, I'm doing this, I'm building this?
A lot of what I've learned, I've had to teach myself, but I was only able to teach myself those things through other people's hard work. And so part of it is a huge way to just sort of pay it forward and repay the people who, taught me everything I know about publishing. Because a lot of them were indie authors, themselves 10 years before I was doing it. So that's a huge part of it. But it's also that sense of community. My work as an archaeologist, I see the impact that humans can have on one another, and how we really can't make it through anything without each other. And that's not just like some pretty flowery language. I mean, seriously, we can't. So, And no one person can do everything, and that's something that I really like to focus on. And that was part of my transition to making it more cooperative was, well, here are my strengths and here are definitely some of my weaknesses, so let's see what your strengths and weaknesses are, and then let's get a whole group together, and we can make everything much better that way.
Yeah. And just for clarification, so cooperative, you're talking rather than essentially being a publisher, you're being a collective that are all working together to amplify those voices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, using the Amphibian Press umbrella as, an added sense of, I'm vouching for this person, or they're vouching for me. And, we definitely have a screening process and so forth. So it's not just anyone who can jump in.
Yeah.
But I found that really takes some of the pressure off. And, it's also a really great way to have the support, like the actual mental and emotional support as well, not just the financial or the workload.
Coming back slightly to marginalized voices, what are some of the things that you see in other people's fiction that are potentially misrepresenting the queer and disabled? You're ready for this question, mate? So, what are some of
there's a list.
Yeah, what are some of the common mistakes that people get wrong when trying to write queer or disabled characters?
I mean, there are many things, but I think one of the main things is either distilling that person down to only that aspect of their identity, or thinking that all people who fall within that identity are the same and have had the same experiences. That's definitely part of it. A lot of villains are either queer coded or outwardly obviously disabled. And that's something that I'm so tired of seeing. So that those are sort of my main nitpicky things. But I think something I'd like to see more of, to sort of put a positive spin, I would like to see stories where people of those identities are just sort of going through their lives. Like it's an aspect of their identity, but it's not everything about who they are, and the story itself isn't about it. I think that's one of the other things that I'd rather not see, is people telling a story about being queer or about being disabled when they themselves are not, because that can get into some iffy areas. So
Yeah. Speaking from a personal experience, I do find that, because I've written a number of books behind me, and thinking about it, I've probably only ever had one homosexual character in any of my books. And speaking for myself, I know that there's almost a fear in me of trying to write these kind of characters or including them in any way, just through the possibility that I might get them wrong and end up upsetting people. So what would you say to people who are potentially in a similar position to me, who, want to feature more of these kind of characters, play with it a little bit more? Because, fiction is, a lot of fiction is you putting yourself into other people's positions who you might not necessarily have another chance to be. So what would you say to people? I know one of the things you said is obviously don't treat it as almost like a highlighted feature, but just make it, just a bit of background about the character. Like they're still people. So what are some of the key things that you'd say to someone like myself that struggles with that?
I mean, first of all, definitely try. I know that there is a big push for own voices fiction. And I did just, say, don't write about an experience if you haven't had it. But, there's also a weird policing there of, well, who's allowed to write what stories. And I think as far as these specific identities go, definitely try. And I think, reading fiction written by people who share those identities, and seeing the characters that they create, but also realizing that they're just like any other character, that you might choose to write. It is just a piece of their identity. Not saying that you can just, swap one thing out, swap some pronouns out and everything's fine, because that's usually not. But also, get feedback from other people. Hire a sensitivity reader if it's a professional project that you're working on, or maybe share it with someone that you trust to be like, can you tell me if I'm being a jackwagon here?
Learning a lot of words from you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, sensitivity readers are fantastic. I've hired them for my projects that include disabilities that I don't have, like being deaf, and it is invaluable. they're just the little tiny things that you wouldn't even think of, because you can imagine some of the big things, but the tiny things are really where you can slip up.
Do you think sensitivity readers, because it didn't used to be as big a thing back, 5-10 years ago, having sort of sensitivity readers able to look at your work and do this. Do you think we're reaching a point where sensitivity readers are almost going to have to be a step within the editing process itself, just because of how, I guess, how wide voices can be reached, and obviously with the climate as it is with social media and everything else? Is that something that is going to work itself into just the process of writing?
I hope so. I know that does put a financial strain on newer authors and marginalized authors. However, I think, if you can find a sensitivity reader who's also a content editor, you can have multiple things taken care of there. And also, you don't need to hire a sensitivity reader for the side character who, makes your main character's frappuccino or whatever. But anyone who really impacts the plot or who is a point of view character, I think definitely you should. And I have seen larger publishing houses, dipping their toes into the sensitivity reading waters. I've also seen multiple examples where they clearly didn't. But I think also just if you have the ability to have a big team behind your book, making sure that everyone who's involved, comes from various different backgrounds, because as long as you have people like that involved and they know that their voices will be listened to, if they're like, this is not it, buddy, then you can really make your project shine in a way that, isn't harmful.
Must really be like fingers on a chalkboard to read work where you're just like, oh, they just do not get it.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you can tell it's just being clumsy, and sometimes you can tell, oh my God.
Yeah. Do you have any particular books that you'd recommend to people who might be interested in writing these kind of characters? Obviously, your own books to start with, but do you have any that you think are worth people checking out, reading, and just seeing what it's all about?
Oh, for sure. I mean, if you're a cyberpunk fan, O.E. Tierman writes the Aces High Joker's Wild series, and that is such an incredible series. I mean, it's cyberpunk, but there's queer characters, there's disabled characters, there's so many different cultures, and they're all this wonderful found family. And some of them are a little clumsy with the way they interact with each other, but for the most part, it's a really great show and showing of how to do it right. Definitely their work. The fourth book is out, and I think there's going to be a total of 7, so that's
nice.
Exciting.
Cool. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. We spoke a little bit about, obviously, you're talking about I'm trying to think what the word was, cooperative working with Amphibian Press. And one thing I came across was your Star's Edge series is a shared universe with Cameron J. Quinn. Talk to me a little bit about how that works in terms of sharing a universe while trying to write your own books within that world.
It's complicated. So luckily we're both very driven writers. I mean, she's a much faster writer than I am. But our approach to writing is pretty similar, and our sort of attention to detail with craft is similar. So that's been really helpful that we're kind of on the same page there. But it was kind of an accident. It started out with her Starsborough series. I thought, wouldn't it be funny if, your character Tabby was my main character Nell's ex, because Nell has a zillion exes and a zillion exes. So, I thought that'd be kind of funny. Like, let's just put a little cameo for people who happen to read both. And it just sort of went from there. And now we have like this whole timeline, which is in a Google Doc. So whenever one of us gets a new story idea, we'll have a video chat nowadays. But we'll sit down and have a conversation about like, well, where will this fit in? And well, if your characters blow up that thing, then my characters will have to have visited it, this time period. It's a whole complicated thing. But it's, there's no, we haven't yet written a single work together, which I think makes it a little bit easier. And our genres, while they heavily overlap, they're not entirely the same, which also makes it a little bit easier for some of that wiggle room to be there.
That's a very interesting way to approach it. Because what I've seen a lot is people who do either one person has led and built the universe and then other people sort of jump in. And I guess, like you say, that's a little bit of what happened here. Or people who jump in and write the books together and then split off and start bringing different people in. So
Right.
how did that conversation come across, and how do you approach building each work and trying to fit in? I know you mentioned obviously you've got the timelines, you've got sort of a bit of the background, but is there an element of needing the styles to be relatively consistent, or are you saying, the world is this particular world and we just write our stories within it as we would write any of our other stories?
Mostly the latter. When it comes to sharing characters, so in the example of Tabby, in the second book of my Nell Bentley series, Nell sort of ends up back on Tabby's stoop in sort of a like, hey, it's life or death. That's the only reason why I'm here. I'm sorry. This is how it's going to be. And so when I wrote that, while I wrote the scene, I had read Cameron's character Tabby multiple times in the few times that she showed up in the Starsborough Chronicles. So I sort of had an idea for Tabby's character, but then afterwards I sent that scene to Cameron and said, like, can you read through it? And she made a few edits as far as like the way Tabby spoke, and like, well, she might not do that, but she could probably do this, which would still work in the scene. And that was really the closest we've come to more like co-writing. But for the most part, her books take place sort of both before and then after the Nell Bentley series. So as long as, like I said, certain things are blown up when they're supposed to be, and, no one's visiting areas that are off limits or whatnot, or have zombies in them. When they wouldn't, it's pretty fine.
Marketing wise, how do you cross pollinate the two? Do you push people to the other series? How do you sort of advertise both, if you do?
Yeah, we definitely do some cross promotion. Whenever one of her books is being released, I'll mention it to my newsletter and vice versa. But she is my former business partner with Amphibian, so for a while it wasn't really necessary because we were under the same umbrella. But now she's sort of taken a different direction with her work, and so we'll do shout outs. We'll both share things on social media, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's any more than we would normally, because we've been long time writing partners.
I want to ask a question that feel free not to answer, because I know that sometimes it can be behind closed doors and all that kind of stuff, but I know you mentioned there that obviously you guys started Amphibian Press relatively together and then you've gone your separate ways. In managing the conversation of going in those separate directions, how did you work that between each other? Was it something amicable? Because again, I know that's something that can be sort of heightened with emotion. Sometimes it can be quite difficult to come out of that situation when you both built something with just like an air of grace around you. So are you happy to answer that question about how you managed to talk it through?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, transparency, right?
Yeah.
So we started out as best friends. And then I happened to mention to her that I was working on this thing called Smoke and Rain.
Is that her skull?
Like, oh. No. Wait. No, it's not her. No, but I happened to mention to her that I had this project, and then she was like, oh, well, I'm also working on this thing. And so we were friends first, and we are still friends. And we're like long time friends, but it was very emotional when we chose to go our separate ways. But that was honestly because we hadn't been communicating some of the issues that we were having. So it sort of came to a boiling point. And finally, both of us sat down and I said, what if you did your own thing and we just did each other favors when we needed the extra help, and I did my own thing? And both of us were just so relieved when we sat, it was like at a coffee shop, a local coffee shop back when we could do that.
The good old days.
Yeah. And, it was incredibly nerve-wracking, but honestly, I think if we had just talked to each other, it would have been much, much easier. But we still are great friends. And I think we're both really, really happy with the separate directions that our careers have gone, and we still help each other out all the time.
Yeah, it's something so fundamentally important about getting into any kind of partnership together. And I wrote a book on collaborating for authors this year, and there's a big section in there about sort of managing those conflicts and making sure that everything aligns, and yeah, absolutely, and the realization that it's so much more than just like a peer friendship when you actually get into these things. Like it's it can be compared to sort of romantic relationships, because there is that real investment from two people to bring this thing to life and to work on it, and to communicate back and forth. And I definitely think that being able to navigate when you have changed your mind or come to a point where you want to split off and do something else, and being able to come out of that the other side stronger, is something that I've seen quite a lot of people fail at. But obviously, from the sounds of it, you guys obviously manage it well, and that's a testament to your friendship.
Definitely. I mean, I think part of it was both of us realized it's either we go our separate ways, professionally, or we go our separate ways permanently. And that wasn't a sacrifice either of us were willing to make.
Yeah. I'll switch gears a little bit and get a little bit less emotional. I've seen on your website that you, as well as obviously having your list of books and links to Amazon and everywhere that they're sold, you do a bit of direct selling as well. And as someone who is nowhere yet in the direct selling game, I just wondered if you had any advice or what your kind of approach is when it comes to direct selling, and also how effective you find it as well.
Well, the store is maybe a month old at the time. So, definitely I'm still, I've got my training wheels on. It's something that, because I write marginalized voices, I want my work to be available to as many people and as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. So that was definitely part of why I wanted to do direct selling, because it's just one more option, especially with a lot of the issues justified issues people have with companies like Amazon. I wanted to give people an alternative that was still very easy to find, because a lot of the smaller, especially ebook sites, you kind of have to go through a whole rigmarole to get what you're looking for. So that was definitely part of it. I think really the key for me has been not focusing purely on one avenue, whether that's KDP or Amazon, or Drafted Digital or any of those other sites. I find sort of spreading things as widely as possible has been the most effective for me. I know other genres, it's really different. So that's really been the main thing. But also, as far as success goes, a lot of people, especially fellow creators, really want to, while they might not have a lot of money to spend on your work, they want it to go the furthest. And so if you say like, oh, but if you buy directly from me, it really helps me out that much more. They get to have a little ego boost when they buy it well. And that I think that's helpful.
Yeah. How are you handling stock at the minute? Is it a case of everything you've listed, you've had to bring in sort of physical stock yourself?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is through, print on demand. Luckily, I did have a small stock here because my local bookstore wasn't able to get any of the books from Ingram because of the pandemic. So that's been a big issue. But normally I do have a small stock, and then, I just sort of build in time with the shipping time when I need to.
Fantastic. So spreading your product as wide as possible. Are we talking about your typical sort of conversation, which is all in with Amazon versus wide? Are you sort of just with Draft Digital, Smashwords, or do you have sort of other avenues as well that maybe are a little less known of that you might be able to share?
I mean, definitely Drafted Digital and all of their listed companies that they distribute to. Also, libraries and local bookstores. There are a couple different sites that distribute to specifically indie bookstores that some bookstores use instead of Ingram as their stockist, which I think is really important. But also in the medium in which your book is done. So not just ebook or paperback or hardcover, but also, of course, audiobook. That's been a huge thing, though. I myself am not an audiobook listener. I would love for more people to be able to listen to my book as well, especially with the disability rights. It's great for someone who might not be able to read physical books, to be able to listen to them.
Absolutely. Going a little bit into pen names, because and by all means, again, tell me to push away if I've got this wrong. But I saw that you have another pen name under some romance books. Yes. And is that still a thing that you're currently working on, that you're chipping away with, as well as the other books?
Yeah, that's back burner. It's definitely something I would like to do. It's sort of when I need to really reset my brain. Because a lot of my sci-fi and fantasy, it's really, really dark. Of course, like one of my romances, there's like character death, so the plots themselves aren't necessarily dark, and I'd like to be able to have that palate cleanser. I think it's also really important to see queer and disabled people just living life happily and having relationships and having friendships where it's not about coming out or anything like that, or about their pain, or in the case of some tragic romance movies that are more popular these days, where it's like, oh well, I'm just the lesson for you who's an able-bodied person to learn how to like actually enjoy life. I've had it with that too. So that's definitely sort of something I'm focusing on. It's not my main focus. I don't think romance will ever be my main focus as an author, but it's something I definitely, I have several small works in progress that I'm gonna throw out there when they're eventually done.
And I think I know the answer to this, but is there a reason that you chose V.S. Holmes for your fantasy and sci-fi, and then a different pen name? I don't know if you want to announce a pen name or not, so I'll just not at this point. But a different name for romance. Was there a reason that you went for the different ones for different genres?
It was really marketing. So Victoria Spencer is my romance pen name. You can obviously see the V.S. Victoria Spencer. So I wanted some connection there, but I wanted something that was easy to spell and easy to remember. And as far as the romance goes, I wanted it to have a little bit of romance in it. So that was my choice there. But then with VS, initials sell more books in sci-fi fantasy because of sexism. So that was part of it. And also, I was looking at names that are easy to remember, easy to spell. And as far as Holmes goes, it's in the middle of the alphabet. It's in the middle of the shelf right in front of you. So there's a lot of planning.
Yeah. Is that a fact that its initials sell better in those genres?
If you are a femme presenting person, you will sell more books if you have initials than if your name is, Tom or George.
Gotcha. Yeah. I was just thinking most of the fantasy that I read, to be fair, I'm mostly just J.R.R. Tolkien, so that's all. That's where my heart lies.
I think that's actually a factor too. Is a lot of the big names, George R. R. Martin, J.R.R. Tolkien. There are initials in there, and I think that's sort of a comforting thing when it's familiar, maybe.
If I ever go into fantasy, which at some point I might, because I originally started in fantasy until I realized that I was too premature of a writer to be able to do any of that. I'm probably going to have an RR in there somewhere just to join the leagues of my idols.
Homage, yeah.
Yes. We are coming close to time. So I've got one more main question before I go into a quick fire round. And it's a question that I ask all of my guests, and that is, V.S. Holmes, why do you write?
I write because I want people to be able to see themselves in books and see what they are capable of, which sounds like an awful lot of hubris, but it took a very long time for me to see myself in books, and it changed my world, and I would like to change someone's world.
I love it. I'll just end the interview there. But no, we've got a bit of silliness coming up. So I've got a quick fire round now, which is 10 questions I'm going to throw at you as quickly as possible. Some of them are multiple choice. Other ones it's literally all for fun. So feel free to pass at any point. But are you ready?
I guess so, yes.
The first one I think is going to be quite difficult. Science fiction or fantasy?
Reading or writing? I shouldn't be asking questions.
Either
fantasy.
Or. Okay. You have an entire cinema to yourself. What film do you watch?
Interstellar.
What's your favourite flavour of ice cream?
Chocolate with all of the random flavored bits in it.
Nice. What are you currently reading?
I'm currently reading A Single Light by Tosca Lee.
Oh, fantastic. What time do you wake up on a typical day?
Crack of dawn.
What's the most expensive thing you've ever asked Santa for?
Santa for probably a pony. I didn't get one.
Nice. Who's your favourite fictional character of all time?
Oh, that is impossible. Ellie Arroway.
You get given $10,000 for a vacation. Where do you go and what do you do?
Oh, well, we can't go anywhere now. I
Pretend all that crap hasn't happened.
I would probably go to Mongolia.
Nice. Lara?
I would just go say archaeology.
Lara Croft or Indiana Jones?
Lara Croft.
What's your favourite song to get amped up to?
Oh, anything instrumental. I love Hidden Citizens.
Nice. And that's 10 questions. One extra question is, where can my listeners find out everything about yourself and all that you're working on?
They can check me out at vsholmes.com, and I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
Beautiful. And I'll put links to all of your places in the show notes. But yeah, V, thank you so much for spending this time with me. It's been a genuine pleasure having a chance to talk.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
No worries. And thank you everyone for listening, and I will see you next week. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Great Writer Share podcast. Next week, we've got a special Halloween episode for you, as myself and John Crinan join forces with the hosts of This Is Horror, Michael David Wilson and Bob Pastorella, and present to you Great Writers Scare. Don't forget you can get early access to every episode of the Great Writer Share podcast and the chance to ask upcoming guests any of your questions just by becoming a patron of the show. All you need to do is visit www.patreon.com/Great Writer Share and support the show for as little as $1 a month. One more time, that's www.patreon.com/Great Writer Share. Until next time.